Hey everybody, welcome to No Opinion. My name is Terrell Hussein, and on this channel what we do is we read legal filings of cases that are interesting to me. So there is a little bit of opinion. The filing that we're going to read today is the superseding indictment that Jack Smith filed in the District Court of Columbia. I'm kind of reading as I'm going. This is going to be the first time I've ever done this with printing the document out, and I'm not going to put the document on the screen, but I will provide a link to it in the description. As I'm reading this, I'll try to interject some voice inflection, no opinion, unless something is really stunning. But so far, everything I've heard about this document is Jack Smith hit it out the park, given the Supreme Court's ruling on immunity of a president when doing presidential acts. But the one thing in all the reviews that I've seen so far, nobody reads the whole thing. They just cherry pick the specific parts that they like. So in this one, I'm just going to read the whole thing so we know what exactly is being said. No opinion here is being added because I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a judge. I am just a citizen that is amazed at all the court filings that a person can file if they have the money to pay for it. So with that, we'll get started. In the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, United States of America versus Donald J. Trump, defendant. Superseding indictment. I'm not going to cover the violations here because they're covered within the document itself as they're going over each one. So, the grand jury charges that at all times material to this superseding indictment on or about the dates at the appropriate times stated below. Introduction. The defendant, Donald J. Trump, was a candidate for President of the United States in 2020. He lost the 2020 presidential election. Despite having lost, the defendant, who is also the incumbent president, was determined to remain in power. So for more than 2 months following Election Day, on November 3rd, 2020, the defendant spread lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election that he had actually won. These claims were false, and the defendant knew that they were false. But the defendant used his campaign to repeat these widely, disseminate them. Anyway, to make his knowingly false claims appear legitimate, create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and erode public faith in the administration of the election. As a candidate and as a citizen, the defendant had the right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to claim falsely that there had been outcome determinative fraud during the election that he had won. He was also entitled to formally challenge the results of the election through lawful and appropriate means, such as by seeking recounts or audits of the popular vote in states or filing lawsuits challenging ballots and procedures. Indeed, in many cases, the defendants did pursue these methods and contesting the election results. His efforts to change the outcome in any state through recounts, audits, or legal challenges were uniformly unsuccessful. Shortly after Election Day, the defendant also pursued unlawful means to discounting legitimate votes and subverting the election results. In doing so, the defendant perpetrated 3 criminal conspiracies. A conspiracy to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government in violation of 18 U.S.C. 371. B. A conspiracy to corruptly obstruct and impede the January 6 congressional proceedings at which the collected results of the presidential election are counted and certified, the certification process, in violation of 18 U.S.C. And C. Conspiracy against the right to vote and to have one's vote counted, in violation of 18 U.S.C. Each of these conspiracies, which built on the widespread mistrust the defendant was creating through pervasive and destabilizing lies about election fraud, targeted a bedrock function of the United States federal government, the nation's process for collecting, recounting, and certifying the results of the presidential election, the federal government function. In furtherance of these conspiracies, the defendant tried and failed. I noticed I had that piece of paper. Sorry about that. And failed to enlist the vice president, who also the defendant's running mate, and by virtue of the Constitution, the president of the Senate, who plays a ceremonial role in the January 6 certification proceedings. Count 1. Conspiracy to defraud the United States. The allegations contained in paragraph 1 through 5 of this superseding indictment are realigned and fully incorporated here by reference. The conspiracy: from on or about November 13th, 2020, through or on January 20th, 2021, in the District of Columbia, and elsewhere, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators, known and unknown to the grand jury, to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government. Purpose of the conspiracy. The purpose of the conspiracy was to overturn the illegitimate results of the 2020 presidential election by using knowingly false claims of election fraud to obstruct the federal government's function by which these results are collected, counted, and certified. The defendant's co-conspirators. The defendant enlisted co-conspirators to assist him in his criminal effort to overturn legitimate results in the 2020 presidential election and retain power. These co-conspirators included the following individuals, none of whom were government officials during the conspiracies, and all of whom were acting in a private capacity. Co-conspirator 1, a private attorney whom the defendant put in charge of his campaign litigation efforts and who was willing to spread knowingly false claims and pursue strategies that the defendant's 2020 re-election campaign attorney would not. Co-conspirator number 2, a private attorney who devised and attempted to implement a strategy to leverage the vice president's ceremonial role, overseeing the certification proceedings to obstruct certification of the presidential election. Co-conspirator 3, a private attorney who made unfounded claims of election fraud that the defendant embraced and publicly amplified. Co-conspirator number 5, a private attorney who assisted in devising and attempting to implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification process. Co-conspirator 6, a private political consultant who helped implement a plan to submit fraudulent slate of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceedings. The federal government function. The federal government function by which the results of the election for president of the United States are collected and counted, certified, were established through the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act, ECA, a federal law enacted in 1887. The Constitution provides that individuals called electors select the president and that each state determine for itself how to appoint the electors appropriated to it. Through state laws, each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia chose to select their electors based on the popular vote of the state. After Election Day, the ECA required each state to formally determine or ascertain the electors who would represent the state's voters by casting electoral votes on behalf of the candidate who had won the popular vote, and required the executive of each state to certify to the federal government the identities of those electors. Then, on the date set by the ECA, each state ascertained electors were required to meet and collect the results of the presidential election. That is, cast electoral votes based on their state's popular vote, and to send their electoral votes along with the state's executive's certification that they were the state's legitimate electors to the United States Congress to be counted and certified in an official proceeding. Finally, the Constitution and the ECA required on the 6th of January following Election Day that the Congress meet in a joint session for a certification proceeding presided over by the Vice President as President of the Senate to count the electoral votes, resolve any objections, and announce the results, thus certifying the winner of the presidential election as the president-elect. This federal government function, from the point of ascertainment to certification, is foundational to the United States democratic process, and until 2021 had operated in a peaceful and orderly manner for more than 130 years. Manner and means. The defendant's conspiracy to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function through dishonesty, fraud, and deceit included the following manner and means. The defendant and co-conspirators used knowingly false claims of election fraud to get state legislatures and elected election officials to subvert the legitimate election results and change electoral votes for the defendant's opponent, Joseph R. Biden Jr., to the electoral votes for the defendant. This is on the pretext of baseless fraud claims. The defendant pushed officials in certain states to ignore the popular vote, disenfranchise millions of voters, dismiss legitimate electors, and ultimately cause the ascertainment of and voting by illegitimate electors in favor of the defendant. The defendant and co-conspirators organized fraudulent slates of electors in 7 targeted states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, attempting to mimic the procedures that the legitimate electors were supposed to follow under the Constitution and other federal and state laws. This included causing the fraudulent electors to meet on the day appointed by federal law on which legitimate electors were to gather and cast their votes, cast fraudulent votes for the defendant, and sign certificates falsely representing that they were legitimate electors. Some fraudulent electors were tricked into participating based on the understanding that their votes would be used only if the defendant succeeded in outcome determinative lawsuits within their state, which the defendant never did. The defendant and co-conspirators then caused these fraudulent electors to transmit their false certificates to the vice president in his capacity as the president of the Senate and government officials to be counted at the certification proceeding January 6th. The defendant and co-conspirators attempted to enlist the vice president in his ceremonial role as president of the Senate on January 6th certification proceedings to fraudulently alter the election results. First, using knowingly false claims that of election fraud, the defendant and co-conspirators attempt to convince the vice president to use the defendant's fraudulent electors, reject legitimate electoral votes, and send legitimate electoral votes to the state legislature for review rather than counting them. When that failed on the morning of January 6th, the defendant and co-conspirators repeatedly, knowingly, false claims of election fraud to gather supporters, falsely told them that the vice president had the authority to and might alter the election results, and directed them to the Capitol to obstruct the certification proceedings and exert pressure on the vice president to take fraudulent actions he had previously refused. After it became public on the afternoon of January 6th that the vice president, as president of the Senate, would not fraudulently alter the election results, a large, angry crowd, including many individuals whom the defendant had deceived into believing the vice president could and might change the election results, violently attacked the Capitol and halted the proceedings. As violence ensued, the defendant and co-conspirators exploited the disruption by redoubling efforts to levy false claims of election fraud and convince members of Congress to further delay the certification based on those claims. The defendant's knowledge of falsity of his election fraud claims. Throughout the conspiracies, the defendant, co-conspirators, and their agents made knowingly false claims that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the 2020 presidential election. These false claims were unsupported, objectively unreasonable, and ever-changing, and the defendant and co-conspirators repeated them even after they were publicly disproven. These prolific lies about election fraud included dozens of specific claims that there had been substantial fraud in certain states, such as that large numbers of dead, non-resident, non-citizens, or otherwise ineligible voters had cast ballots, or that voting machines had changed votes for the defendant to votes for Biden. These claims were false, and the defendant knew they were false. He makes no words here at all, man. He's very, very direct. That's why I like reading these, because I like reading these because they're written in plain English. And woo, man, he's coming hard. The defendant was on notice that his claims were untrue. He was told so by those most invested in his reelection, including his own running mate, and his campaign staff. Federal and state courts rejected every outcome determinative post-election lawsuit filed by the defendant. Co-conspirators and their allies, state officials including election directors and secretaries of state in his own political party, issued public statements dispelling the defendant's and co-conspirators' myth of widespread election fraud. And on November 12th, the National Association of Secretaries of State and National Association of State Election Directors and other organizers issued a statement on behalf of several coordinated entities declaring the 2020 election to be the most secure election in American history, and that there was no evidence that any voting systems deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised. The defendant continued to make false claims, nonetheless, with deliberate disregard for the truth, including through his Twitter account. Throughout the conspiracies, although the defendant sometimes used his Twitter account to communicate with the public as president about official actions and policies, he also regularly used it for personal purposes, including to spread knowingly false claims of election fraud, exhort his supporters to travel to Washington, D.C. on January 6th, pressure the vice president to misuse his ceremonial role in the certification proceedings, and leverage the events of the Capitol on January 6th to unlawfully retain power. The defendant continued his lies through the day of the certification proceedings on January 6th. The morning the defendant gave a campaign speech at a privately funded, privately organized political rally held on the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. During the speech, the defendant used many of the same unsupported, objectively unreasonable, and publicly disproven lies to exhort the gathered crowd to march to the Capitol. I'm going to pause there. Anybody else? I watched that when it happened, and I watched that when it happened in real time. So I don't know. It didn't seem real now, and it doesn't even seem real as I'm restating it within a court document. It still doesn't seem like that should have ever happened. But anyway, the criminal agreement enacts to effect the object of the conspiracy. To effect the object of the conspiracy, the defendant and co-conspirators committed one or more of the acts set forth below. The defendant used deceit to get some state officials to subvert legitimate election results and change electoral votes. Shortly after Election Day, which fell on November 3rd, 2020, the defendant launched his criminal scheme. On November 13th, the defendant's campaign attorney conceded in court that he had lost the vote count in the state of Arizona, meaning based on the assessment the defendant's campaign advisor had given him just a week earlier, the defendant had lost the election. So that day, the defendant turned to co-conspirator 1, whom he announced on November 14th would spearhead his efforts going forward to challenge the election results. From that point on, the defendant and co-conspirators executed a strategy to use knowing deceit in targeted states to impair, obstruct, and defeat the federal government function, including as described below. The defendant had no official responsibilities related to any state's certification of the election results. Arizona. On November 13th, 2020, the defendant had a conversation with his campaign manager, who informed him that a claim that had been circulating that a substantial number of non-citizens had voted in Arizona was false. On November 22nd, 8 days before Arizona's governor certified the assertment of the state's legitimate electors based on popular vote, the defendant and co-conspirator 1 called the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives and make knowingly false claims of election fraud aimed at interfering with the ascertainment of and voting by Arizona electors as follows. The defendant and co-conspirator falsely asserted, among other things, that the substantial number of non-citizen, non-residents, and dead people had voted fraudulently in Arizona. The Arizona House Speaker asked co-conspirator 1 for evidence of claims, which co-conspirator 1 did not have, but claimed he would provide. Co-conspirator 1 never did. Defendant and co-conspirator 1 asked the Arizona House Speaker to call the legislature into session to hold a hearing based on their claims of election fraud. The Arizona House Speaker refused, stating that doing so would require 2/3 votes of its member, and he would not allow it without actual evidence of fraud. The defendant and co-conspirators the defendant and co-conspirator 1 asked the Arizona House Speaker to use the legislature to circumvent the process by which legitimate electors would be ascertained for Biden based on the popular vote, and replace those electors with a new slate for the defendant. The Arizona House Speaker refused, responding that the suggestion was beyond anything he ever heard or thought of as something within his authority. On December 1st, co-conspirator 1 met with Arizona House Speaker when the Arizona House Speaker again asked co-conspirator 1 for evidence of the outcome determinative election fraud he and the defendant had been claiming. Co-conspirator 1 responded with words to the effect of, "We don't have the evidence, but we have lots of theories." On December 4th, and my dove didn't like that either. On December 4th, Arizona House Speaker issued a public statement that said in part, "No election is perfect. And if there..." Oh, he's just getting feisty today. "No election is perfect, and there were evidence of illegal votes or improper count, then Arizona law would provide a process to contest the election, a lawsuit under state law. But the law does not authorize the legislature to reverse the results of an election. As a conservative Republican, I don't like the results of the presidential election. I voted for President Trump and worked hard to re-elect him. But I cannot and will not entertain a suggestion that we violated current law to change the outcome of a certified election. I and my fellow legislators swore an oath to support the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution and laws of the state of Arizona. It would violate that oath, the basic principle of Republican government, and the rule of law if we attempted to nullify the people's votes based on unsupported theories of fraud. Under the law that we wrote and voted upon, Arizona voters chose who wins, and our system requires their choice be represented." On the morning of January 4th, 2021, co-conspirator 2 called Arizona House Speaker to urge him to use a majority of the legislature to decertify the state's legitimate electors. Arizona's validly ascertained electors had voted 3 weeks earlier and sent their votes to Congress, which was scheduled to count these votes in Biden's favor in just 2 days' time at the January 6th certification proceedings. When the Arizona House Speaker explained the state investigations had uncovered no evidence of substantial fraud in the state, co-conspirator 2 conceded that he didn't know enough about the facts on the ground in Arizona, but nonetheless told the Arizona House Speaker to decertify and let the courts sort it out. The Arizona House Speaker refused, stating that he would not play with the oath he had taken to uphold the United States Constitution and Arizona law. In his campaign speech on January 6th, defendant publicly repeated the knowingly false claim that 36,000 non-citizens had voted in Arizona. Georgia. As early as mid-November, the defendant's senior campaign advisor informed the defendant that his claims of a large number of dead voters in Georgia was untrue. On November 16, 2020, on the defendant's behalf, his executive assistant sent co-conspirator 3 and others a document containing bullet points critical to a certain voting machine company, writing, "See attached. Please include as is or almost as is in lawsuit." Co-conspirator 3 responded 9 minutes later, writing, This is all in caps. It must go in all suits in GA and PA immediately with a fraud claim that requires the entire function to be set aside in those states and machines impounded in nonpartisan professionals inspections. On November 25th, co-conspirator number 3 filed lawsuits against the governor of Georgia, falsely alleging massive election fraud accomplished through the voting machines company's election software and hardware. Before the lawsuit was even filed, the defendant retweeted a post promoting it. Co-conspirator 3 of Georgia's lawsuit was dismissed December 7th. On December 3rd, co-conspirator 1 orchestrated a presentation to a judiciary subcommittee of the Georgia State Senate with the intention of misleading state senators into blocking the ascertainment of legitimate electors. During the presentation, a campaign attorney and agent of the defendant and co-conspirator 1 falsely claimed that more than 10,000 dead people voted in Georgia. That afternoon, a senior advisor to the defendant told the defendant's chief of staff through text message, just an FYI, a campaign lawyer, and his team verified that the 10,000 supposed dead people voting in Georgia is not accurate. It was alleged in co-conspirator 1's hearing today. The senior advisor clarified that he believed the actual number was 12. It was 12. Huh. Another agent of the defendant and co-conspirator 1 played a misleading excerpt of a video recording of ballot counting at State Farm Arena in Atlanta. It insinuated that it's showing election workers counting suitcases of illegal ballots. Co-conspirator 2 encouraged the legislature to decry or decertify the state's legitimate electors based on false allegations of election fraud. Also on December 3rd, the defendant issued a tweet amplifying the knowingly false claim made by co-conspirator 1 presentation to Georgia. Wow, blockbuster testimony taking place right now in Georgia. Ballot stuffing by Dems when Republicans were forced to leave the large counting room. Plenty more coming, but this alone leads to an easy win for the state. On December 4th, the Georgia Secretary of State's chief operating officer debunked the claim made by co-conspirator 1's presentation the previous day using the tweet stating, the 90-second video of election worker at State Farm Arena purporting to show fraud watched in its entirety shows normal ballot processing. Here's the fact check on it. On December 7th, he reiterated during the press conference that the claim that there had been misconduct at the State Farm Arena was false. On December 8th, the defendant called the Georgia Attorney General to pressure him to support an election lawsuit filed in the Supreme Court by another state's Attorney General, which sought to invalidate election results in certain targeted states like Pennsylvania. The Georgia Attorney General told the defendant that officials had investigated various claims of election fraud in the state, including the State Farm Arena allegations, and were not seeing evidence to support them. The following day, Representative co-conspirator number 2, the defendant, not as president, but in his capacity as a candidate for office, moved to intervene and join the state's Attorney General lawsuit. On December 11th, the Supreme Court denied the suit. Also, on December 8th, the senior campaign advisor who spoke with the defendant on a daily basis had informed him on multiple occasions that various fraud claims were untrue, expressed frustration that many of co-conspirator 1 and his legal team claims could not be substantiated. With respect to the persistent false claims regarding the State Farm Arena, the senior campaign advisor wrote in an email, "When our research and campaign legal team can't back up any of the claims made by our elite strike force legal team, you can see why we're 0-32 on the cases. I'll obviously hustle to help all fronts, but it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracies and shit beamed down from the mothership." That's pretty damn direct language right there. On December 10th, 4 days before Biden's validly ascertained electors were scheduled to cast votes and send them to Congress, co-conspirator 1 appeared at a hearing before the Georgia House of Representatives Government Affairs Committee. Co-conspirator 1 played the State Farm Arena video again and falsely claimed that it showed voter fraud right in front of people's eyes and was the tip of the iceberg. Then he called 2 election workers by name, baselessly accused them of quite obviously, surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they were vials of heroin or cocaine. He suggested that they were criminals whose place of work, their homes, should have been searched for evidence of ballots, for evidence of USB ports, for evidence of voter fraud. Thereafter, the 2 elected workers received numerous death threats. On December 31st, the defendant signed verifications affirming false election fraud allegations made on his behalf in a lawsuit in the capacity as a candidate for the president against the Georgia governor and the Secretary of State in advance of filing co-conspirator 2, who was advising the defendant on the lawsuit, acknowledged in an email that he and the defendant had, since signing the previous verification, been made aware of some of the allegations and evidence proffered by experts had been inaccurate, and that signing a new affirmation with the knowledge and incorporation of reference would not be accurate. The defendant and co-conspirator 2 caused the defendant's signed verification to be filed nonetheless. On January 2nd, 4 days before Congress certification proceedings, the defendant had chief of staff who sometimes handled private and campaign-related logistics for the defendant and private attorney involved in the lawsuit against Georgia's Secretary of State called the Secretary of State. That bird. During that call, the defendant lied to the Georgia Secretary of State to induce him to alter Georgia's popular vote count and call into question the validity of the Biden electors' vote, which had been transmitted to Congress weeks before, including as follows. The defendant raised allegations regarding the State Farm Arena video and repeatedly disparaged one of the same election workers that co-conspirator 1 had maligned on December 10th, using her name almost 20 times and falsely referring to her as a professional vote scammer and hustler. In response, the Georgia Secretary of State refuted this. "You're talking about the State Farm video, and I think it's extremely unfortunate that co-conspirator 1 and his people, they sliced and diced that video and took it out of context." When the Georgia Secretary of State then offered a link to a video that would disprove co-conspirator 1's claim, The defendant responded, "I don't care about a link. I don't need it. I have a much better link." The defendant asked about rumors of paper ballots cast in the election were being destroyed, and the Georgia Secretary of State counsel explained to him that the claims had been investigated and they weren't true. The defendant claimed that 5,000 dead people voted in Georgia, causing the Georgia State Secretary of State to respond, "Well, Mr. President, the challenges that you have is the data you have is wrong. The actual number were two. Two people were dead that voted. And your information is wrong. That's two. That was just two." The defendant claimed that thousands of out-of-state voters had cast ballots in Georgia's election, which the Georgia Secretary of State counsel refuted, explaining, "We've been going through each of those as well, and those numbers that we got," the defendant counsel was just saying, "they're not accurate. Every one we've been through are people that lived in Georgia, moved to a different state, but then moved back to Georgia legitimately. They moved back in years ago. This was not like something just before the election." In response to multiple other of defendant's allegation, the Georgia Secretary of State counsel told the defendant that Georgia Bureau of Investigation was examining all such claims and finding no merit in any of them. The defendant said that he needed to find 11,780 votes and insinuated that the Georgia Secretary of State and his counsel could be subject to criminal prosecution if they failed to find election fraud, as he demanded, stating, "And you are going to find that they are, which is totally illegal. It's more illegal for you than it is for them, because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal. You know, that's a criminal offense. And, you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to the Georgia Secretary of State counsel, your lawyer." The next day, January 3rd, the defendant falsely claimed that the Georgia Secretary of State had not addressed the defendant's allegations publicly, stating that Georgia Secretary of State was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as the ballots under the table scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue. In his campaign speech on January 6, the defendant publicly repeated the knowingly false insinuation that more than 10,300 dead people had voted in Georgia. Michigan. On November 20th, 2020, after outreach by the chairman of the Republican National Committee, RNC, and just 3 days before Michigan governor signed a certification of ascertainment notifying the federal government that based on the popular vote, Biden's electors were to represent Michigan voters, the defendants held a meeting in the Oval Office with the Speaker of the Michigan House of Representatives and the Majority Leader of the Michigan Senate. The defendant included in the meeting by phone RNC chairwoman, who joined only briefly, and co-conspirator number 1. The defendant and co-conspirator 1 raised false claims, including the illegitimate vote dump in Detroit. In response to the Michigan State Majority Leader told the defendant that he had lost Michigan not because of fraud, but because the defendant outperformed with certain voter populations in the state. Upon leaving their meeting with Michigan House Speaker and Michigan Senate Majority Leader, issued the statement reiterating thus: the Senate House Oversight Committee were actively engaged in and through review of Michigan's electoral process, and we have faith in our committee process to provide a greater transparency and accountability to our citizens. We have not yet been able to be made aware of any information that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan. And as legislative leaders, we will follow the law and follow the normal process regarding Michigan electors, just as we have throughout this election. On December 4th, co-conspirator 1 sent a text message to the Michigan House Speaker reiterating his unsupported claim of election fraud and attempting to get the Michigan House Speaker to assist in reversing the ascertainment of the legitimate Biden electors, stating, "Looks like Georgia may well hold some factual hearings and change the certification under our trill. That makes no sense. Article 2, Section 1 and 2 of the Constitution. As co-conspirator 1 explained, they don't have the right to do it, but the obligation. Help me get this done in Michigan." Similarly, on December 7th, despite still having established no fraud in Michigan, co-conspirator 1 sent a text intended for the Michigan Senate Majority Leader. "So I need you to pass a joint resolution from the Michigan legislature that states the election is in dispute. There's an ongoing investigation, but the legislature and the electors sent by Governor Whitmer are not official electors of the state of Michigan and do not fall within the safe harbor deadlines of December 8th under Michigan law." On December 14th, the day that electors in states across the country were required to vote and submit their votes to Congress, the Michigan House Speaker and Michigan Senate Majority Leader announced that, contrary to the defendant's request, that they would not decertify the legitimate election results or electors in Michigan. The Michigan Senate Majority Leader's public statement included, "We have not received evidence of fraud on a scale that would change the outcome of the election in Michigan." The Michigan House Speaker's public statement read in part, "We diligently examined these reports of fraud to the best of our ability. I fought hard for President Trump. Nobody wanted him to win more than me. I think he's done an incredible job, but I love our republic too. I cannot fathom risking our norms, traditions, and institutions to pass a resolution retroactively changing the electors for Trump, simply because some think there may have been enough widespread fraud to give him the win. That's unprecedented for good reason. And that's why there is not enough support in the House to cast a new state of electors. I fear we lose our country forever. This truly would bring mutually assured destruction for every future election in regards to the Electoral College, and I can't stand for that. I won't." And I just gotta say, man, as I read this, there were so many opportunities for this to fail if it wasn't for essentially these people with ethics, that they had ethics, man. You gotta applaud them for that, man. In his campaign speech on January 6th, the defendant publicly repeated knowingly false claims of an illicit dump of more than 100,000 ballots in Detroit. I guess what I'm saying, on one side, I see a lot of ethics. On the other side, I see something other than ethical behavior. which is at the basis of this lawsuit. So let's continue on and let's go to Pennsylvania. What happened in Pennsylvania? Well, let's find out. On November 11th, 2020, the defendant publicly maligned a Philadelphia city commissioner for stating on the news that there was no evidence of widespread fraud in Philadelphia. As a result, the Philadelphia city commissioner and his family received death threats. On November 25th, the day after Pennsylvania governor signed a certificate of ascertainment and thus certified to the federal government that Biden's electors were legitimate electors for the state. Co-conspirators, one, orchestrated an event at a hotel in Gettysburg attended by state legislators. Co-conspirator one falsely claimed that Pennsylvania had issued 1.8 million absentee ballots and received 2.5 million in return. In the days thereafter, the campaign staffer wrote internally that co-conspirator one's allegations was just wrong. And there's no way to defend it. The deputy campaign manager responded, "We have been saying this for a while. It's very frustrating." On December 6th, after 4 Republican leaders in Pennsylvania legislature issued a public statement that the General Assembly lacked the authority to overturn the popular vote and appoint its own slate of electors, and that doing so would violate the state election code and constitution, the defendant retweeted a post labeling the legislator cowards. In his campaign speech on January 6th, the defendant publicly repeated his knowingly false claims that there had been 205,000 more votes than voters in Pennsylvania. On to Wisconsin. On November 29th, 2020, a recount in Wisconsin that the defendant's campaign had petitioned and paid for did not change the election results, and in fact increased defendant's margin of defeat. On December 14th, the Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected an election challenge by the campaign. One justice wrote, "Nothing in this case casts any legitimate doubt that the people of Wisconsin lawfully chose Vice President Biden and Senator Harris to be the next leaders of our great country." On December 21st, as a result of the state Supreme Court's decision, the Wisconsin governor, who had signed the certificate of ascertainment on November 30th, identified Biden's electors as the state's legitimate electors, signed a certificate of final determination in which he recognized that the state Supreme Court had resolved the controversy regarding the appointment of Biden's electors, and confirmed that Biden had received the highest number of votes in the state and that his electors were the state's legitimate electors. That same day, in response to the court's decision that he promoted, the same day in response to the court's decisions that he had prompted the Wisconsin's governor to sign a certificate of final determination, the defendant issued a tweet repeating his knowingly false claim of election fraud and demanding that the Washington legislature overturn the election results that had led to the ascertainment of Biden's electors and the legitimate electors. That word was not coming out that time. In his campaign speech on January 6, 2021, the defendant publicly repeated knowingly false claims that there had been tens of thousands of unlawful votes in Wisconsin. The defendant's use of dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to organize fraudulent slate of electors and cause them to transmit false certificates to Congress. As the defendant's attempt to obstruct the electoral vote through deceit of state officials met with repeated failure, beginning in early December 2020, and co-conspirators developed a new plan to marshal individuals who would have served as the defendant's electors had he won the popular vote in 7 targeted states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and caused those individuals to make and send the Vice President and Congress false certifications that they were legitimate electors. Under the plan, the submission of those fraudulent slates will create a fake controversy at the certification proceeding and position the Vice President presiding on January 6 as President of the Senate to supplant legitimate electors with defendant's fake electors and certify the defendant as president. The defendant had no official responsibilities related to the convening of legitimate electors or their signing and mailing of their certificates of vote. The plan capitalized on ideas presented in a memorandum drafted by co-conspirator 5, an attorney who was assisting the defendant's campaign with legal efforts related to recount in Wisconsin. The memorandum evolved over time from a legal strategy to preserve the defendant's right to a corrupt plan to subvert the federal government's function by stopping Biden's electors' votes from being counted and certified as followed. On November 18th, memorandum Wisconsin memo advocate that because of ongoing recount to Wisconsin, the defendant's electors there should meet and cast votes on December 14th, the date the ECA required appointed electors to vote. To preserve the alternative of the defendant's Wisconsin electoral slate in the event the defendants ultimately prevailed in the state. On December 6th, memorandum, fraudulent elector memo marked a sharp departure from the co-conspirator 5's Wisconsin memo, advocating that the alternative electors originally conceived to preserve the right of Wisconsin instead be used in a number of states as fraudulent electors to prevent Biden from receiving the 270 electoral votes necessary to secure the presidency. On January 6, the fraudulent electors memo suggested that the defendant's electors in 6 purportedly contested states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, should meet and mimic as best as possible the actions of legitimate Biden electors. And that on January 6th, the vice president should open and count the fraudulent votes, setting up a false controversy that would derail the proper certification of Biden as president-elect. December 9th, memorandum. Fraudulent elector instructions consisted of co-conspirators 5 instructions on how fraudulent electors could mimic illegitimate electors in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Co-conspirator 5 noted that in some states, it would be virtually impossible for fraudulent electors to successfully take the same steps as the legitimate electors because state law required formal participation in the process by state officials or access of official resources. Interesting. The plan began in early December, and ultimately the co-conspirators and the defendants' campaign took the Wisconsin memo and expanded it to any state that the defendant claimed was contested, even New Mexico, which the defendant had lost by more than 10% of the popular vote. This expansion was forecast by emails the defendant's chief of staff sent on December 6th, forwarding the Wisconsin memo to campaign staff and writing, "We just need to have someone coordinate the electors for the states." On December 6th, defendant and co-conspirator 2 called the RNC chairman to ensure that the plan was in motion. During the call, co-conspirator 2 told the RNC chairman that it was important for the RNC to help defendant's campaign gather electors in targeted states and falsely represent to her that such elector votes would be used only if ongoing litigation in one of the states changed the results in the defendant's favor. After the RNC chairwoman consulted the campaign and heard that work on gathering electors was on the way, she called and reported this information to the defendant, who responded approvingly. On December 7th, co-conspirator 1 received the Wisconsin memo and the fraudulent electric memo. Co-conspirator 1 spoke with co-conspirator 6 regarding attorneys who could assist in the fraudulent elector effort in the in the targeted states, and he received from co-conspirator number 6 an email identifying the attorneys in Georgia, in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The next day, on December 8th, co-conspirator 5 called the Arizona attorney on co-conspirator 6 list. In the email after the call, the Arizona attorney was recounted his conversation with co-conspirator 5 as follows. I just talked to this gentleman who did that memo, co-conspirator 5. His idea is basically that all us, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Pennsylvania, etc., have our electors send in their votes, even though the votes aren't legal under federal law, because they're not signed by the governor, so that members of Congress can fight about whether they should be counted on January 6th. They could potentially argue that they're not bound by federal law because they're Congress and make the law. Kind of wild, creative. I'm happy to discuss. My comment to him was that I guess there's no harm in it, legally at least, i.e., we would just be sending fake elector votes to Pence so that someone in Congress can make an objection when they start counting votes and start arguing that the fake votes should be counted. As co-conspirators 1's direction, on December 10th, co-conspirator 5 sent 2 points of contact all targeted states except Wisconsin, which had already received his memo, and New Mexico, a streamlined version of the Wisconsin memo, which did not reveal the intended fraudulent use of the defendant's electors and the fraudulent electors' instructions, along with fraudulent elector certifications that he had drafted. The next day, on December 11th, through co-conspirator 5, co-conspirator 1 suggested that Arizona lawyer file petition for certain Terrio in the Supreme Court as the pretext to claim that litigation was pending in the state to provide cover for the convening and voting of the defendant's fraudulent electors. Co-conspirator 5 explained that co-conspirator 1 had heard about the state officials and the state's provisional electors, that it could appear treasonous from the AZ electors to vote on Monday if there's no pending court proceedings. Oh, that's interesting. To manage the plan in Pennsylvania on December 12th, co-conspirator 1, co-conspirator 5, co-conspirator 6 participated in a conference call organized by defendants' campaign with defendants' electors in that state. When the defendants' electors expressed concern about signing certificates representing themselves as legitimate electors, co-conspirator 1 falsely assured them that their certification would be used only if the defendant succeeded in litigation. Subsequently, co-conspirator 6 circulated proposed conditional language to that effect for potential inclusion in the fraudulent electoral certificates. A campaign official cautioned not to offer the conditional language to other states because the other states are signing what he prepared. If it gets out, we change the language for PA, it could snowball. In some cases, the defendant's electors refuse to participate in the plan. On December 13th, co-conspirator 5 sent co-conspirator 1 an email memorandum that further confirmed the co-conspirators' plan was not to use the fraudulent electors only in the circumstance that the defendant's litigation was successful in one of the targeted states. Instead, the plan was falsely presented the fraudulent slates as alternatives to legitimate slates at Congress's certification proceedings. On the same day, the defendant asked the senior campaign advisor for an update on what was going on with the electors' plan and directed him to put out a statement on electors. As a result, co-conspirator 1 directed the senior campaign advisor to join the conference call with him, co-conspirator 6, and others. When the senior campaign advisors related those developments in the text message, the deputy campaign manager, senior advisor for the defendant, and the campaign staffer, the deputy campaign manager responded, "Here's the thing. The way this has morphed, it's crazy to play, so I don't know who wants to put their name on it." The senior advisor wrote, "Certifying illegal votes?" In turn, the participants in the group text message refused to have the statement regarding electors attributed to their names because none of them could stand by it. Also on December 13th, at a campaign staffer's request, co-conspirator 5 drafted and sent fraudulent electors certifications for the defendant's electors in New Mexico, which had not previously been among the targeted states, and where there were no pending litigation on the defendant's behalf. The next day, the defendant's campaign filed an election challenge suit in New Mexico at 11:54 a.m., 6 minutes before the noon deadline for the electors' votes, as a pretext so that there was pending litigation there at the time of the fraudulent electors voted. On December 14th, the legitimate electors of all 50 states and District of Columbia met in their respective jurisdictions to formally cast their votes for president, resulting in a total of 232 electoral votes for the defendant and 306 for Biden. The legitimate electoral votes that Biden won in the states that the defendant targeted and the defendant's margin of defeat were as follows: Arizona 11 electoral votes, 10,457 votes. Georgia 16 electoral votes, 11,779 votes. Michigan 16 electoral votes, 154,188 votes. Nevada 6 electoral votes, 33,596 votes. New Mexico 5 electoral votes, 99,720 votes. Pennsylvania 20 electoral votes, 80,555 votes. And Wisconsin 10 electoral votes, 20,682 votes. On the same day, at the direction of the defendant and co-conspirator 1, fraudulent electors convened sham proceedings in the 7 targeted states to cast fraudulent electoral ballots in favor of the defendant. In some states, in order to satisfy legal requirements set forth by the legitimate electors under state law, state officials were enlisted to provide fraudulent electors access to state capitol buildings so they could gather and vote there. In many ways, however, as co-conspirator 5 had predicted, the fraudulent electors' instructions, the fraudulent electors were unable to satisfy the legal requirement. Nonetheless, as directed by the fraudulent elector instructions, shortly after the fraudulent electors met on December 14th, the targeted states' fraudulent electors' certificates were mailed to the President and Senate, the archivists of the United States, and others. The defendant and co-conspirators ultimately used the certificates for their fraudulent electors to deceitfully target the government function, and did so contrary to how fraudulent electors were told they would be used. Unlike those of the fraudulent electors consistent with the ECAs, the legitimate electors signed certificates were annexed to the state's executive certifications of ascertainment before being sent to the President of the Senate and others. That evening, 6:26 p.m., the RNC chairwoman forwarded to the defendant through his executive assistants an email titled Elector Recap Final, which represented that in 6 contested states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the defendant's electors had voted in parallel to Biden's electors. The defendant's executive assistant responded, "It's in front of him." The defendant attempts to enlist the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6th certification proceedings. On January 6th, congressional certification proceedings approached, and his other efforts to impair, obstruct, and defeat federal government functions failed. The defendant sought to enlist the vice president to assist in the plan to use his role as president of the Senate to fraudulently alter the election results. The defendant had no official responsibilities related to the certification proceedings, but he did have a personal interest as a candidate in being named the winner of the election. All of the conversations between the defendant and vice president described below focused on defendant maintaining power. When his efforts to use the vice president's role as president of the Senate failed, the defendant attempted to use a crowd of supporters that he had gathered in Washington, D.C. to pressure the vice president to fraudulently alter the election results. On December 19, 2020, after cultivating widespread anger and resentment for weeks with his knowingly false claims of election fraud, the defendant urged his supporters to travel to Washington on the day of the certification proceedings, tweeting, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. Will be wild." Throughout late December and early January, the defendant repeatedly urged his supporters to come to Washington for January 6th. On December 23rd, defendant retweeted a memo titled Operation Pence Card, which falsely asserted that the vice president could, among other things, unilaterally disqualify legitimate electors from 6 targeted states. On the same day, co-conspirator 2 circulated a 2-page memorandum outlining a plan for vice president to unlawfully declare the defendant the certified winner of the presidential election. Just 2 months earlier, on October 11th, co-conspirator 2 had taken the opposite position, writing that neither the Constitution nor the ECA provided that the vice president's desertion in counting the electoral votes or permitted him to make the determination on his own. On December 25th, when vice president called the defendant to wish him a Merry Christmas, the defendant quickly turned the conversation to January 6th and his request that the vice president, as the president of the Senate, reject the electoral votes that day. The vice president pushed back, telling the defendant as the vice president already had previous conversation, I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome. On January 1st, the defendant called the vice president and berated him because he learned the vice president had opposed the lawsuit seeking a judicial decision that at the certification, the vice president had the authority to reject or return votes to the states under the Constitution. The vice president responded that he thought there was no constitutional basis for such authority, and thus it was improper. In response, the defendant told Vice President, "You're too honest." Within hours of the conversation, the defendant reminded his supporters to meet in Washington before the certification proceeding, tweeting, "The big protest rally in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 on January 6. Location details to follow. Stop the steal." On January 3rd, the defendant again told Vice President that at the certification proceedings, the Vice President had the absolute right to reject electoral votes and the ability to overturn the election. The Vice President responded that he had no such authority and that a federal appeals court had rejected the lawsuit, making that claim the previous day. On January 3rd, Co-Conspirator 2 circulated the second memorandum that included a new plan under which, contrary to the ECA, the Vice President would send the electoral slate to the state legislature to determine which slates to count. On January 4th, the defendant held a meeting with Co-Conspirator 2 and Vice President, the Vice President, Chief of Staff, and Vice President Counsel. The defendant's White House counsel did not attend. During the meeting, as reflected in Vice President's contemporaneous notes, the defendant made knowingly false claims of election fraud, including, bottom line, "We won every state by 100,000 votes, and we won every state." The defendant and Co-Conspirator 2 then asked Vice President to either unilaterally reject legitimate electors from the 7 targeted states or send the question of which states slate of legitimate to the targeted states legislature. When the Vice President challenged Co-Conspirator 2 on whether the proposal to return the question to the states was defensible, Co-Conspirator 2, "Well, nobody's tested it before." The Vice President then told the defendant, "Did you hear that? Even your own counsel is not saying I have the authority." The defendant responded, "That's okay. I prefer the other suggestion of Vice President rejecting the electors unilaterally." Also on January 4th, the Co-Conspirator 2 acknowledged to the senior advisor that no count would support his proposal. And the senior advisor told Co-Conspirator 2, "You're going to cause a riot on the streets." Co-Conspirator 2 responded that there had previously been points in the nation's history where violence was necessary to protect the republic. On the morning of January 5th, at the defendant's direction, the Vice President's Chief of Staff and the Vice President Counsel met again with Co-Conspirator 2. Co-Conspirator 2 now advised the Vice President do what the defendant had said he preferred that day before, unilaterally rejecting electors from the targeted states. During this meeting, Co-Conspirator 2 privately acknowledged to the Vice President Counsel that he hoped to prevent judicial review of his proposal because he understood that it would be unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court. The Vice President's counsel expressed to Co-Conspirator 2 that following through with the proposal would result in a disastrous situation where the election might have to be decided in the streets. Yeah, my gosh, man. The same day, the defendant encouraged supporters to travel to Washington, D.C. January 6th, and he set the false expectation that Vice President had the authority to and might use his ceremonial role as the President of the Senate at the certification proceedings to reverse the election outcome in the defendant's favor, including issuing the following tweet at 11 a.m. The Vice President has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. This was within 40 minutes of the defendant's earlier reminder. See you in D.C. At 5:45 p.m., I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow on the Ellipse at 11 a.m. Arrive early. Doors open at 7 a.m. Eastern. Big crowd. Also on January 5th, the defendant met alone with the Vice President. When the Vice President refused to agree to the defendant's request that he use his position as President of the Senate to obstruct the certification, the defendant grew frustrated and told the Vice President that the defendant would have to publicly criticize him. Upon learning of this, Vice President's Chief of Staff was concerned for the Vice President's safety and alerted the head of the Vice President's Secret Service detail. That night, the defendants approved and caused defendant's campaign to issue a public statement that the defendant knew from his meeting with the Vice President only hours earlier was false. The Vice President and I are in total agreement that the Vice President has the power to act. On January 6th, starting in the early morning hours, the defendant again turned to knowingly false statements aimed at pressuring the Vice President to fraudulently alter the election outcome and raised publicly the false expectation that the Vice President might do so. At 1 a.m., the defendant issued a tweet that falsely claimed, if Vice President at Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistakes they made in certifying the incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in the process, not approved by their Senate legislature, which it must be. Mike can send it back. At 8:17, the defendant issued a tweet that falsely stated, states want to correct their votes, which they now know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt processes never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage. On the morning of January 6th, an agent of the defendant contacted the United States Senator to ask him to hand deliver documents to the Vice President. The agent then facilitated receipt by the Senator's staff of the fraudulent certification signed by the defendant's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin, which were believed not to have been delivered to the Vice President on archivist by archivist mail. When one of the Senator's staffers contacted staffers for the Vice President by text message to arrange for delivery of the Senator's and Senator staffer had been told were alternate slates of electors for Michigan and Wisconsin because archivists didn't receive them. The Vice President staffers rejected them. At 11:15 a.m., the defendant called the vice president and again pressured him to fraudulently reject the return of Biden's legitimate electoral votes. The vice president again refused immediately after the call. Defendant decided to single out vice president in public remarks he would make within the hour, reinserting language that he had personally drafted earlier that morning, falsely claiming that the vice president had the authority to send electoral votes to the states. But that advisor had previously successfully advocated he removed. Earlier that morning, the defendant had selected co-conspirator 2 to join co-conspirator 1 in giving public remarks before his case. When they did so, based on knowingly false election fraud claims, co-conspirator 1, co-conspirator 2 intensified pressure on the vice president for fraudulently obstructing the certification proceedings. Co-conspirator 1 told the crowd that vice president could cast the ECA aside and unilaterally decide on the validity of those crooked ballots. He also lied when he claimed to have letters from 5 legislators begging us to send elector slates to the legislature for review, and called for trial by combat. Co-conspirator 2 told the crowd, all we're demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not. We no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question. Next, beginning at 11:56 a.m., the defendant made multiple knowingly false statements integral to his criminal plan to defeat the federal government's function, obstruct the certification, and interfere with others' right to vote and have their votes counted. The defendant repeated false claims of election fraud, gave false hope that the vice president might change the election outcome, and directed the crowd in front of him to go to the Capitol as a means to obstruct the certification and pressure the vice president to fraudulently obstruct the certification. The defendant's knowingly false statements for those purposes included: A. The defendant falsely claimed that based on fraud, the vice president could use his position as president of the Senate to alter the outcome of election results, saying, I hope Mike's going to do the right thing. I hope so, because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we will win the election. All he has to do, all this is from the number one, or certainly one of the top constitutional lawyers in the country. He has the absolute right to do it. We're supposed to protect our country, support our Constitution, and protect our Constitution. States want to revote. The states got defrauded. They were given false information. They voted on it. Now they want to recertify. They want it back. All Mike Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify, and we become president, and you are the happiest people. After the defendant falsely stated that Pennsylvania legislature wanted to recertify the votes, they want to recertify. But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. The crowd began to chant, send it back, send it back. The defendant also said that regular rules no longer applied, stating that, and fraud breaks up everything, doesn't it? When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. The defendant specifically referenced the process by which electoral votes are counted during the proceedings, including by stating, we have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have lawfully been lawfully slated. Finally, after exhorting that we fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. The defendant directed the people in front of him to head to the Capitol, suggested he was going with them, and told them to give members of Congress the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. During and after the defendant's remarks, thousands of people marched towards the Capitol. The defendant's exploitation of violence, and the chaos at the Capitol. Shortly after 1 p.m., the Vice President issued a public statement explaining that his role as President of the Senate at the certification proceedings did not include unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not. Before the defendant had finished speaking, a crowd began to gather at the Capitol. On the floor of the House of Representatives, the Vice President, in his role as President of the Senate, began the certification proceedings. At approximately 1:11 p.m., the Vice President opened their certificate of votes and certificates of ascertainments that the legitimate electors for the states of Arizona had mailed to Washington, consistent with the ECA. After a congressman and senator lodged an objection to Arizona's certification, the House and Senate retired to their separate chambers to debate the objection. A mass of people, including individuals that had traveled to Washington and to the Capitol at the defendant's direction, broke through barriers cordoning off the Capitol grounds and advanced on the building, including by violently attacking law enforcement and officers trying to secure it. Beginning around 1:30, the defendant, who had returned to the White House after concluding his remarks, settled in the dining room off the Oval Office. He spent much of the afternoon reviewing Twitter on his phone, while the television in the dining room showed live events at the Capitol. And I'm going to pause here. This really did happen. You know, we literally were sitting in our homes on that day, watching people essentially go into the Capitol and climb walls, literally climbing walls, flying all of these flags, these weird flags that they created, and it was a hell of a sight to see, a hell of a sight to share with the rest of the world. Also, you know, we are America, and we are seen by many as something to hate, something to be jealous of. So I'm sure some people's across the world's hearts were broken, whereas others were just loving every minute of it. So anyway, at 2:13 p.m., after more than an hour of steady violent advancements, the crowd at the Capitol broke into the building and forced the Senate to recess. At approximately 2:30 p.m., the official proceedings having been interrupted, staffers evacuating from the Senate carried with them the legitimate elector certificates of votes and their governor's certifications of ascertainment. The House also was forced to recess. At 2:24 p.m., the defendant personally, without assistance, issued a tweet intended to further delay and obstruct the certification. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or incorrect ones, which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. 1 minute later, at 2:25, the United States Secret Service was forced to evacuate the vice president to a secure location. At the Capitol throughout the afternoon, members of the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence. Where is Pence? Bring him out." And Traitor Pence. On the evening of January 6th, the defendant and the co-conspirator one attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol by having co-conspirator one call lawmakers to convince them, based on knowingly false claims of election fraud, to delay the certification proceedings in which the defendant had no official role, including from 6:59 to 7:22, co-conspirator one placed calls to 5 United States senators and 1 United States representative. Co-conspirator 6 attempted to confirm phone numbers of 6 United States senators whom the defendant had directed co-conspirator 1 to call and attempt to enlist further delaying the certification. In one of the calls, co-conspirator 1 left the voicemail intended for a United States senator that said, "We need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get these legislators to get more information to you." And I know they're reconvening at 8 tonight, but the only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues so that we get ourselves into tomorrow, ideally until the end of tomorrow. In another meeting intended for another United States senator, in another message intended for another United States senator, co-conspirator 1 repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud, including that the vote counts certified by the states to Congress were incorrect, and that the governors who had certified knew they were incorrect, and the illegal immigrants had voted in substantial numbers in Arizona, that Georgia gave you a number in which 65,000 people who were underage voters, and co-conspirator 1 also claimed that the vice president's actions had been surprising and asked the senator to object to every state and kind of spread this out a little bit like a filibuster. The attack on the Capitol obstructed and delayed the certification approximately 6 hours until the Senate and House of Representatives came back into session separately at 8:06 and 9:02, respectively, and came together in a joint session at 11:35 p.m. At 11:44, co-conspirator 2 emailed Vice President's counsel advocating that the Vice President violate the law, seek further delay the certification. Co-conspirator 2 wrote, "I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation of the ECA and adjourn for 10 days to allow legislators to finish their investigations, as well as allow for a full forensic audit of the massive amount of illegal activity that has occurred here." At 3:45 a.m., January 7th, President of the Senate and the Vice President announced the certification results of the 2020 presidential election in favor of Biden. In violation of Title 18 United States Code 371, Count 2, conspiracy to obstruct official proceedings. The allegations entertained in paragraph 1 through 5 and 9 through 100 of this superseding indictment are realigned and fully incorporated here by reference. from on or about November 13th, 2020 through on or about January 7th, 2021, the District of Columbia, elsewhere, the defendant. Donald J. Trump did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators known and unknown by the grand jury to corruptly obstruct and impede an official proceeding, that is, the certification of the electoral votes, in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 1512. Count 3. The allegations contained in paragraph 1 through 5, and 9 through 100 of this superseding indictment are realigned and fully incorporated by reference. From on or about November 13, 2020 to January 7, 2021, in the District of Columbia and elsewhere, the defendant, Donald J. Trump, attempted to and did corruptly obstruct and impede an official proceeding, that is, the certification of the electoral votes. Count 4, conspiracy against rights. The allegations contained in paragraph 1 through 5, 9 through 100 of this superseding indictment are realigned and fully incorporated here by reference. From on or about November 13, 2020 through and to January 20th, 2021 in the District of Columbia and elsewhere. The defendant, Donald J. Trump, did knowingly combine, conspire, confederate, and agree with co-conspirators known and unknown to the grand jury to injure, oppress, threaten, and intimidate one or more persons in the free exercise and enjoyment of a right and privilege secured to them by the Constitution and laws of the United States, that is the right to vote and to have one's vote counted. Jack Smith. All right, that's it. And having read both of the documents, I can see what they were talking about, in that they really took out all the references, that would have anything to look anything at the least presidential, because the way that it was situated, I guess, from the Supreme Court, presidential acts, and none of these acts really were presidential. So that's going to set up for an interesting another document that will probably be filed within the next week or so by Donald Trump's attorneys. And like I said, that's what I really, I won't say I like about this, or that I find disturbing about these things, is that it all really, what it exposes to me is that as long as you have money, you could file any lawsuit you want, as long as you're willing to pay for it. And that's also true for hiring lawyers. The lawyer is just paid. If essentially a lawyer is working for the person that hires them, not working for the truth. They're just working to win the case for the person that's paying them. And there's a lot of lawyers out there that are willing to make that dollar. I can't fault them, because they got the education, they did the work, and if somebody's willing to pay you to do something, you go ahead and do it. But the part that stands out in all of this, man, is these intersections of people with ethics, with people of conscience, with people that put their honor above their personal feelings, And by saying by their honor, I'm saying by honoring their commitments that they make, and in their case, their commitments to being an elected official to support the Constitution. if you like this kind of content, man, please like and subscribe. These do take a lot more time to do than just having AI read it. And you know what? AI probably read it a lot better than I do. And but if you like what I'm doing, I take any encouragement I can get. If I'm doing something that you don't like, let me know where I can improve. Again, this is just, I do this because they're interesting, they're well written, and they are all of the facts. And as long as these are the documents that are being used to support our democracy, then the truth is there. Not opinions, the truth. And that's where we stand right now, is that the truth is under attack. So let's see whose truth wins. Thank you for watching. I'm Terrell Hussein. This is No Opinion.